A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, Chapter 25, A Competitive Examination. When the king traveled for change of air, or made a progress, or visited a distant noble whom he wished to bankrupt at the cost of his keep, part of the administration moved with him. It was a fashion of the time. The commission charged with the examination of candidates for posts in the army came with the king to the valley, whereas they could have transacted their business just as well at home, and although this expedition was strictly a holiday excursion for the king, he kept some of his business functions going just the same. He touched for the evil as usual. He held court in the gate at sunrise and tried cases, for he was himself Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He shone very well in this latter office. He was a wise and humane judge, and he clearly did his honest best and fairest according to his lights. That is a large reservation. His lights, his rearing, often colored his decisions. Whenever there was a dispute between a noble, a gentleman, or a person of lower degree, the king's leanings and sympathies were for the former class always, whether he suspected it or not. It was impossible that this should be otherwise. The blunting effects of slavery upon the slaveholder's moral perceptions are known and conceded the world over, and a privileged class, an aristocracy, is but a band of slaveholders under another name. This has a harsh sound, and yet should not be offensive to any, even to the noble himself, unless the fact itself be an offense, for the statement simply formulates a fact. The repulsive feature of slavery is the thing, not the name. One needs but to hear an aristocrat speak of the classes that are below him to recognize, and in but indifferently modified measure, the very air and tone of the actual slaveholder, and behind these are the slaveholder's spirit and the slaveholder's blunted feeling. They are the result of the same cause in both cases, the possessor's old and inbred custom of regarding himself as a superior being. The king's judgments wrought further injustices, but it was merely the fault of his training, his natural and unalterable sympathies. He was as unfitted for judgeship as would be the average mother for the position of milk distributor to starving children in famine time. Her own children would fare a shade better than the rest. One very curious case came before the king. A young girl, an orphan, who had a considerable estate, married a fine young fellow who had nothing. The girl's property was within a seigniory held by the church. The bishop of the diocese, an arrogant scion of a great nobility, claimed the girl's estate on the ground that she had married privately, and thus had cheated the church out of one of its rights as lord of the seigniory. The one heretofore referred to as le droit de seigneur. The penalty of refusal or avoidance was confiscation. The girl's defense was that the lordship of the seigniory was vested in the bishop, and the particular right here involved was not transferable, but must be exercised by the lord himself or stand vacated, and that an older law of the church itself strictly barred the bishop from exercising it. It was a very odd case indeed. It reminded me of something I had read in my youth about the ingenious way in which the aldermen of London raised the money that built the Mansion House. A person who had not taken the sacrament according to the Anglican rite could not stand as a candidate for Sheriff of London. Thus dissenters were ineligible. They could not run if asked. They could not serve if elected. The aldermen, who without any question were Yankees in disguise, hit upon this neat device. They passed a bylaw imposing a fine of £400 upon anyone who should refuse to be a candidate for sheriff, and a fine of £600 upon any person who, after being elected sheriff, refused to serve. Then they went to work and elected a lot of dissenters, one after another, and kept it up until they had collected £15,000 in fines. And there stands the stately Mansion House to this day, to keep the blushing citizen in mind of a long past and lamented day when a band of Yankees slipped into London and played games of the sort that has given their race unique and shady reputation among all truly good and holy peoples that be of the earth. In the girl's case seemed strong to me. The bishop's case was just as strong. I did not see how the king was going to get out of this hole, but he got out. I append his decision. Truly, I find small difficulty here, the matter being even a child's affair for simpleness, as a young bride had conveyed notice, as in duty bound, to her feudal lord and proper master and protector, the bishop, she had suffered no loss, for the said bishop could have got a dispensation making him, for temporary conveniency, eligible to the exercise of his said right, and thus would she have kept all she had, whereas, failing in her first duty, she hath by that failure failed in all. For whoso, clinging to a rope, severeth it above his hands, must fall, it being no defence to claim that the rest of the rope is sound, neither any deliverance from his peril as he shall fall. Pardy, the woman's case is rottenness at the source. It is the decree of the court that she forfeit to the said Lord Bishop all her goods, even to the last farthing that she doth possess, and be thereto mulcted in the costs. Next! Here was a tragic end to a beautiful honeymoon not yet 3 months old. Poor young creatures! They had lived these 3 months lapped to the lips in worldly comforts. These clothes and trinkets they were wearing were as fine and dainty as the shrewdest stretch of sumptuary laws allowed to people of their degree. And in these pretty clothes, she crying on his shoulder, and he trying to comfort her, with hopeful words set to the music of despair, they went from the judgment seat out into the woods, homeless, bedless, breadless. Why, the very beggars by the roadside were not so poor as they. Well, the king was out of the hole, and on terms satisfactory to the church and the rest of the aristocracy, no doubt. Men write many fine and plausible arguments in support of monarchy, but the fact remains that where every man in a state has a vote, brutal laws are impossible. Arthur's people were, of course, poor material for a republic, because they had been debased so long by monarchy, and yet even they would have been intelligent enough to make short work of that law which the king had just been administering, if it had been submitted to their full and free vote. There is a phrase which has grown so common in the world's mouth that it has come to seem to have sense and meaning. The sense and meaning implied when it is used, that is the phrase which refers to this or that or the other nation as possibly being capable of self-government. And the implied sense of it, that there has been a nation somewhere, some time or other, which wasn't capable of it, wasn't able to govern itself as some self-appointed specialists were, or would be to govern it. The masterminds of all nations in all ages have sprung in affluent multitude from the mass of the nation, and from the mass of the nation only, not from its privileged classes, and so, no matter what the nation's intellectual grade was, whether high or low, the bulk of its ability was in the long ranks of its nameless and its poor, and so it never saw the day that it had not the material in abundance whereby to govern itself, which is to assert an always self-proven fact that even the best governed and most free and most enlightened monarchy is still beneath the best condition attainable by its people, and that the same is true of kindred governments of lower grades, all the way down to the lowest. King Arthur had hurried up the army business altogether beyond my calculations. I had not supposed he would move in the matter while I was away, and so I had not mapped out a scheme for determining the merits of officers. I had only remarked that it would be wise to submit every candidate to a sharp and searching examination, and privately I meant to put together a list of military qualifications that nobody could answer to but my West Pointers. That ought to have been attended to before I left, for the king was so taken with the idea of a standing army that he couldn't wait, but must get about it at once, and get up as good a scheme of examination as he could invent out of his own head. I was impatient to see what this was, and to show, too, how much more admirable was the one which I should display to the examining board. I intimated this gently to the king, and it fired his curiosity. When the board was assembled, I followed him in, and behind us came the candidates. One of these candidates was a bright young West Pointer of mine, and with him were a couple of my West Point professors. When I saw the board, I did not know whether to cry or to laugh. The head of it was the officer known to later centuries as Norroy King-at-Arms. The two other members were chiefs of the bureaus in his department, and all three were priests, of course. All officials who had to know how to read and write were priests. My candidate was called first, out of courtesy to me, and the head of the board opened on him with an official solemnity. Name? Malise, son of? Webster. Webster, my memory fails to recall the name. Condition? Weaver. God keep us. The king was staggered from his summit to his foundations. One clerk fainted, the others came near it. The chairman pulled himself together and said indignantly, "It is sufficient. Get you hence." But I appealed to the king. I begged that my candidate might be examined. The king was willing, but the board, who were all well-born folk, implored the king to spare them the indignity